Hi all, and thank you for joining our IOP event, Defund or Reform the Police. My name is Maddie Soskin, and I'm a second-year MPP candidate at the Harris School of Public Policy and currently serve as a graduate chair for the IOP's Student Advisory Board. Perhaps more importantly for today's conversation, though, is that I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where George Floyd was killed at the hands of the police last summer. I watched as the city I loved burned and my hometown became synonymous with racial injustice and broken systems. I watched as the nation took note and called for a countrywide change. Last week, I joined my city in a collective, brief exhale as we watched a Minneapolis jury hold Derek Chauvin accountable. And today, I watch as throughout the US, some call for defunding the police, some for reform, some for accountability, and others for additional resources for police departments, but seemingly all agree that we need to do better. Today, we are joined by a panel that will likely not agree on all topics, but will guide us through a conversation about the police reform movement, its genesis, challenges, and ultimate goals for a better system. We are joined by Josie Duffy Rice, journalist and president of The Appeal, a news publication that offers original journalism about the criminal justice system. Ms. Duffy Rice is a graduate of Harvard Law School and has published many pieces about defunding the police and the abolition movement. We are also joined by Roberto Villaseñor, who is currently the principal consultant for 21 CP Solutions and the former chief of the Tucson Police Department, from which he retired in 2015 after a 35-year career. Villaseñor served in or commanded every division and bureau during his tenure, and in 2014 was appointed to the President's National Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and in 2015 was appointed to the Arizona Criminal Justice Council. Finally, we are joined by the mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, Quinton Lucas. Known as Mayor Q, he took office in August 2019 and has prioritized making Kansas City's neighborhood safer and reducing violent crime. Mayor Q is a graduate of Cornell Law School and is a member of the University of Kansas Law School faculty. Our panel will be moderated by Adam Harris, a staff writer at The Atlantic and author of an upcoming book called The State Must Provide about the inequity in America's colleges and universities. Thank you all for being here today. There could not be a more salient time for this conversation.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Maddie. As she mentioned, I'm Adam Harris, a staff writer at The Atlantic, and thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for our conversation on police reform and where the nation goes from here. Josie, I actually want to go to you first to sort of ground this conversation. When people talk about defunding the police, what are the kind of roots of that movement and what does it mean in practice?
Well, first, I want to say thank you for having me to the University of Chicago. Thank you for moderating, Adam, and I'm so honored to be here with you all and talk to you about this issue. And I also want to say in advance that I apologize for any sound from my toddler or baby, who both are not good at staying quiet, even when asked politely. As you all probably know, in the past year, this idea of defunding the police has kind of entered the national lexicon, the national conversation, in a way that has created a lot of opinions, some divisiveness. I think, I've been working in this field for about 15 years. In the middle, I went to law school, but I started about 15 years ago. I think what I find very interesting is that in all of the conversations about policing and criminal justice reform, I've always seen not necessarily the phrase defund the police, but abolition in the conversation. And so this is reflective, I think, of the broader, but more insular conversation that happens among advocates and among activists around this conversation, around this issue. I think that defund the police has really gained speed and recently, in part because we recognize that police are being asked to solve a host of social ills that they cannot solve and that they are not responsible for. And the question is not just what that does to people, but what it does to police, right? What are we asking from law enforcement? What are we demanding from law enforcement that is actually a different responsibility on the front end instead of a back end solution? I wrote about this issue last year for Vanity Fair, and one of the things that I said was that just noting that obviously policing functions differently between urban and rural environments, poor and wealthy environments, and also Black and brown and white environments, right? And that class and urbanization and gender, and race really matter when it comes to policing. But that we are treating safety and as sort of the way that you treat cancer with chemotherapy, when we could really think about cancer prevention. We could really think about prevention as the goal of a society, not just punishment. And what that means is reallocating resources to the front end of social services instead of to the back end. Budgets reflect priorities. Many budgets in the age of austerity and the post 08 recession and state governments that are controlled by the right, you see a ton of siphoning out resources from local budgets, as these two men know very well, I'm sure. And what that really means is that there's a lot that has to be done with very little. And how do we allocate those very little resources, and where should they go? And should we require and ask the police to do so much to solve these social ills on the back end? I'll just give one quick story, and then I'll move on, which is that a couple of years ago, I had a very strange experience where I was sitting in my house. I've been working remotely for like 6 years, so I'm very used to this Zoom life. And I was sitting in my house, and all of a sudden a huge hawk flew in to my window, broke the glass, shattered everywhere, and was now sitting in the room with me. I ran out of the room. I have no idea what to do about a hawk. I don't like animals. Had no idea what to do. And when I called animal control, they said, we don't do big birds, call the cops. And when I called the fire department, they said, well, we don't know what to do, call the cops. And when I called the private animal expert that I found on Google, they said, call the cops. And what it really said to me was that I guarantee no Atlanta Police Department officer got into this job to get hawks out of houses, but we are asking them to do all of this work, and we are allowing other social services to go to not have the resources to address birds and houses, because we are allocating this money in ways that don't actually make sense for our social goals. And so when I think about defund the police, I think of the hawk, right? Why should I have to call the police to get the hawk out of my house?
Yeah. And actually, to that point, Chief Villaseñor, you in 2017, during the Aspen Ideas Festival, you said something to the effect of, similar to as what Josie was saying, law enforcement is often called on for this to kind of fix this or address this whole range of societal issues. As a member of the President Obama's task force on policing, someone who has written several op-eds about kind of the needs for reform in policing, I guess, what does that necessary reform look like to you?
First off, thank you again for inviting me to this. And second, I didn't know anyone was even there at the Aspen Ideas Festival to take those notes. Kind of impressed. And Josie, if you don't mind, I want to use that story in conversation we have, because that is such an excellent characteristic of what this problem is about. I think most police departments, some do, they take umbrage at the word defund because it kind of has a negative connotation. We're taking everything away. But then they'll be the first to step up and say, why am I going to a hawk in a house call? Why am I going to loud barking dog calls? Why am I going to mental health calls? Why am I going to homeless people calls? Those are not criminal issues. And police should be there to deal with the criminal issues of the day. And the problem is, and the only caveat I put on this is, I have no problem with divesting funds from a police department. I wish we would use that word instead, and putting them into the social services or the community services that need them. The problem is, until that infrastructure is set up and that funding starts, you're going to have the same problem of at 3 a.m. when an owl flies into someone's house because it's nighttime, who's going to respond? Right now, there is no one left to respond other than police. Commissioner Brown, when he was in Dallas, he gave an excellent speech about the over-reliance on police for almost all of societal's ills. And they're not equipped. They're not trained. They're not the type of individuals that you want responding out there when someone's going through an emotional or mental crisis, unless there's a threat to someone else or themselves. And so when those calls come in, if that infrastructure is not already set up, My worry is that we'll defund police, we'll take money away from police, we'll lessen police ranks, but we'll still be calling them for the same type of calls. Now they have even less resources to get out there. So I have no problem with the concept of defund the police. I'm just concerned about how it gets implemented. And I just wish the title was a little bit different so it doesn't set people who don't bother to read into the situation and understand all the aspects of it to think that, well, we're just trying to make police smaller. What we're trying to do is divert it to the front end so that police don't have to respond and it doesn't get to a situation where police are responding to calls they should not be responding to.
And so I'm going to go to Mayor Lucas first, but Josie, I have a follow-up on what Chief Villasenor just mentioned that I want to come to you with. But Mayor Lucas, Kansas City recently passed 2 police reform measures, and kind of more broadly, I know that you've been invested in a sort of lengthier process of reforming the police department in Kansas City. So can you talk to me about those 2 measures, what they do, whether they go far enough, and what kind of Kansas City you hope you can do to kind of reform the police department more broadly?
Well, first of all, I will say, Brother Adam, you're welcome to go to Josie first, because I loved in particular what she said, the analogy on chemotherapy to treat cancer is the way that we're addressing issues of violent crime. The chief is right that we right now ask the police to do a lot in some ways because we are not creative enough. I don't know if we're ambitious enough. I have passed a few different reforms, some of which I think useful, others of which not as far as I would like to go. Rules on body cameras, for example, rules on further accountability, independent civilian complaints, those sorts of things. What I really want to see is us actually make sure we're doing a few things that front end are more important. I'm a big person on decriminalization. You may say decriminalization of what? A lot. Anything that disproportionately has impacted people of color, those who are poor, et cetera. So you hear about marijuana. In Kansas City, we had an effort of decriminalizing parking tickets. So many people that are getting tripped up on warrants are people that had even non-moving violations where there's a warrant for their arrest later, and then they're getting tripped up in the system. And what happens? You're driving somewhere, you get caught, then you have weed on you, then everything else under the sun. And there's this kind of just evolution of offenses that trap you into a world. So making it so we are frankly less punitive in everything that we do so that you're not just hanging charge after charge on people. On the other front end side, right, I had actually been a long day already. The business community in my city calls me all the time. And, you know, other than last year, they all finally decided to tweet Black Lives Matter, God bless them. But then, you know, they don't really do that next step. So for example, we provide summer internships in the hundreds, something that folks like Mayor Marion Barry were doing generations ago in Washington. I asked the businesses, instead of reaching out to me for feel-good moments, why don't you pay for more kids to be at your business, to get more opportunities, to do these sorts of things the statistics have shown reduce, right, crime that they'll be involved in later, all types of things by this dramatic margin. I think that when we look at systems, right, we need to actually call on more of our business community, more of our broad-based city, our larger network, other than just what the police can and cannot do. Instead, saying what we're expecting everyone else to do. And then the other step is making sure that we actually invest in those things we say we care about. Everybody, left to right, every politician I know right now is saying we care about mental health. And then nobody puts a darn cent into anything more. Nobody's putting anything more into that conflict resolution. Now, some jurisdictions do, don't get me wrong, but not a lot. And so I think we need to make sure that as opposed to just a conversation, and I told some of my activist community this, which, you know, like any mayor, some days they like me, other days not so much. But, you know, I said, if you always are fighting a game on somebody else's field, then it's still going to be in their favor. If we're always fighting police budgets about police, and then you get the rest of the community, it's like, well, we like them and we don't, and all of that, it's about policing. Instead, we need to say, if we're building a budget from zero, what do we want it to look like? How much do we want to put into violence interrupters, counselors at our hospitals, right? Conflict resolution in our schools. All those sorts of things are, I think, where the real changes need to be. And I think you would see over time, because you're just not hiring people in the police department to do all that, you do see budget reductions long-term in connection with that.
Thank you so much, Mayor Lucas. Josie, to both Mayor Lucas's and the chief's point, there has been, just kind of speaking to the kind of criminalization of America. I kind of wanted to get your take on the current apparatus that we have for dealing with, say, activity that is characterized as criminal activity, and then to the second point of that the chief was making, just sort of about the language of the movement, the language of the defund movement, how it relates to the broader language of abolition, and then kind of from that point of abolition on down to some of the sort of piecemeal reforms and how that language has shifted.
Yeah, absolutely. Just making sure I was on mute. So a couple of thoughts. One is that all of the people on this panel, obviously, in their day-to-day life, are tasked with different things. I don't actually have to deal with budgets, right? I don't actually have to deal with being elected or keeping my job, depending on the crime rate in my city. And so I think it's worth mentioning that we all serve different purposes in the conversation around this issue, and that part of the role of people like me and advocates in this community, I think, and also journalists, right, is to think about how we frame the world, what kind of what the spectrum is that we present as possible, and to push the conversation along for people who are elected, for police chiefs, for mayors, for people who deal, I think, in a much more granular way with the day-to-day kind of ways in which policing plays out in an environment. So I just mentioned that to say that, like, there is a reason we all have different roles in the system, and that we there's a reason we all are going to kind of fall in different places about where we think about the language, et cetera, because the ways in which we interact with it change. And then the other thing I was just thinking about what Mayor Lucas said is just that I do think over time it's possible we see smaller budgets when we invest in the front end. I think that probably takes a lot of time, and the reason for that is just that, like, it's expensive, right, to have a safe and healthy environment. It is expensive to have a safe and healthy city. It's expensive to have good schools. It is expensive to have good parks. It's expensive to have good after school programs and have people, be able to put food on their kids' table every night. What is much cheaper is taking resources away from people and then blaming them for their own poverty, for their own pain, and for their own situations. And that is the history of American society, right? That is the history of particularly people of color in America. We have not invested in them in any sort of real, consistent way. And we have lived in this bootstrapped, conservative, Adam, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir because I think this is kind of the point of your book, but, we have really siphoned out resources from communities for generations, for the history of this country, and then pretended like austerity and social, what's the term I'm looking for? Not social conservatism, but sort of budget austerity is the responsible thing to do, and it so clearly is not. And so I really feel for people, especially on the municipal level, who do not have the kind of budgets and the kind of resources that they should have to be able to assure the safety of their communities. So I think there's that. In response to your question about crime, I think this is one of my major problems with the way we discuss the relationship between policing and crime in the criminal justice system, is that we imagine that we have conflated the moral definition of what we think is wrong with the legal definition of what a crime is. We know that that actually police are not dealing with the majority of quote unquote crimes that happen. They don't have, we can't actually address every single crime that happens in a community. Plenty of things are crimes that probably shouldn't be crimes. Plenty of things are not crimes, which are harmful, right? The relationship between harm, crime, and bad is not an exact one, and we imagine that it is. And when we really look at how in some communities, in the suburbs, for example, you catch your kid smoking weed and the cops don't ever get involved, and your kid turns out most likely fine, and you maybe punish them at home and you deal with how you want to deal with that, right? In other communities, something simple like possession can set off an involvement with a system that's main goal is to kind of hinder you economically and socially for decades. Even if that one thing doesn't result in you going to jail or being arrested, it puts something on your record that then kind of sets off, that raises the stakes for any other interactions you have for the rest of your life. And so my problem with the way that we talk about crime is just that we see a sort of transactional relationship between policing and crime that just simply does not exist, right? And that in many ways, the ways that harm and crime are dealt with in a community are dependent on wealth and are dependent on access and are dependent on like what is actually a harm. And that kind of changes, I think, the way that we perceive the role of policing. Which I do think that kind of leads to your, and this is the last thing I'll say, but leads to your next question, Adam, on language. Abolition, I think, is not actually, I really love what, all of this comes from a history of not just Black thinkers, but I think in particular Black women who have been thinking about abolition and the framing of policing for again generations. Most recently, I think about Miriam Kaba, I think about Ruth Wilson Gilmore, I think about these people who have led my own intellectual and mental and moral awakening around this issue in so many ways, and some of the more recent ones. I think about Barbara Sally Butts, and I think about Derica Purnell, and people who are really leading the conversation around this. And what I think Ruth Wilson Gilmore says that I always love is that abolition is actually about creation. It's not about destruction. What we're saying is, can we create a world that does not require, that does not have the level of harm that we see right now, that it does not have the level of violence, that it does not exist, where rape and murder and assault are not things we take for granted as existing in spades in our society, but are things that we are trying to eliminate on the front end, so that we don't need policing, so that we don't need a carceral system, so that we don't try to respond to violence with violence. What would we have to do to create a world where, and I'm not trying to get you unemployed, but where we would not need the police at all? And I think that is what we are trying to imagine. Now, do any of us think that world is going to exist when we go to sleep tonight and wake up in the morning? I don't think so. But I believe that as thinkers and as leaders in a community and as writers in a space, right, and as advocates, it is our duty to think big, to imagine what we would want this world to look like if we started from scratch. And that what we would want the world to look like if we started from scratch was a world where we don't need these systems, or these systems never, do not exist. And so I think I think the question is less, need is the wrong word, but where we wouldn't construct these systems, right? And they do not exist. And so when I think about abolition, that's how I think about it. It is the end goal. Defund is maybe a tactic of that goal. And all of this language is incendiary. It is big and it is scary, and it's not going to resonate with everybody. But I think the fact that we're talking about it means in some ways it's working.
Chief Villasenor, there were a couple points it seemed that you wanted to respond, so I'll let you respond to that.
Well, I think those are great goals, but I think where police land is, it's in the more realistic world of what's actually out there. That'd be great if we got to a world and society where rape and murder don't occur, but they have occurred since the history of recorded time. And so we have to deal with the realities of what we have. That doesn't mean that I disagree that we shouldn't work for a better reality. And some of the goals that we should have should be elimination of certain crimes. But the reality that we live in has to be dealt with on a day-to-day basis. And that's where police step in. I wholeheartedly agree about the issue of lesser offenses and the effect that that has on people's lives for such, I mean, I go back on let's just look at marijuana. I mean, we have people who have served years upon years for the simple use of marijuana. And now in those states where they were arrested, including my own, recreational marijuana is legal. So where's the fairness in that? And what has been done with that? These people have had lives destroyed from that. But that's a process that we go through as a society. And right now, police are taking all the blame for all of society's problems, when really it falls upon legislation, courts, prosecutors, defense. It's all part of the system. And when you go forward and these laws that are on the books are there because the majority of society in some fashion, either through voting or not being a part of the game, allow these laws to be put in place, then police are instructed to enforce them. And it seems like everyone says, well, why are cops doing this? Why are cops arresting people for such minor things? It's because society has put those laws in place, and then they hire police to enforce the laws that society has there. I'm not saying those are right laws. I'm just saying that's why we're in the predicament we're in at times. I think that we continue to try and work to improve so that police don't respond. We get them out of areas where they should never be in, that we've discussed here earlier on this call. And we continue to go there, but we can't be so quick to abolish police or defund police. At least I know that's not what's being said, but that is the viewpoint of some. And that causes a backlash and a pushback against that. And I think that the words we use can be very important. And I get the far-reaching aspect of the words and the idea that the words are trying to convey, but the reality of what people hear when they're not of the same mindset or the same thought process as the people who are using those words can be obstructive to those efforts at times. And I think that we have to be cognizant of what's really going on in the world today and how do we address it.
So I want to ask about kind of the practicality aspect, and Mayor Lucas, I actually want to come to you for that point. So as a mayor, kind of tasked with presenting budgets that are balanced, you can't overspend as a mayor. Also kind of tasked with the idea of community safety, and also thinking about the concerns that the community has expressed around policing. I guess, how do you balance those, in some ways, kind of competing ideals, right? You can't go out and say, okay, we're going to devote billions of dollars to this community infrastructure if that money is not in the purse.
Yeah, I mean, the most interesting thing for us this year was that we reduced police budget funding, and it largely had nothing to do with the actual police. It had everything to do with budget challenges, which, that said, tells you a few things, right? We did not see a precipitous increase in violent crime. We were still on the exact same trends we were before, even with a fairly significant cut of about $12.5 million out of our police budget. What does this tell me after a while? A few things, I think, to bring all of them together. I think it is worthwhile for us to try to see, even for those of us in the practical positions, mayors, police chiefs, city councils, to think about what is that society the way we want it. Because frankly, I don't go out to them often, but when I go out to my fancier suburbs of Kansas City, in some ways they have that, right? They have fewer police officers, right? They have a situation where there's often larger investments as a per capita basis in their parks system and any number of things, school spending often high, right? All those sorts of things that suggest there is a path that is in some way different. Of course, they also aren't often dealing with some of the same issues we have, hundreds of years of segregation-related policy, all the other things that built our cities the way that they are. But I think that's something that I've often tried to use as a basis. I think the other thing, though, that you have to be is real about what the problem people have concerns with is. So actually, a block from where I live, which is unique for mayors, 4 people got shot last night. 1 person died. And happens actually a decent amount in this area. And what I hear from people is, actually somebody in my office had talked to somebody. She said, "Did you call the police?" She's like, no, absolutely not, right? She's like, "I saw everybody who was involved, all that sort of stuff." There's that trust issue. And that trust issue is one of the biggest barriers to actually safety, crime solving, all those sorts of things. And so I think you do need to reorient the institution itself, but perhaps even thinking about every year in our budgets as to how do we build other institutions that create that level of trust for somebody. Because I hear a lot of polls all the time or read them, and they're not inaccurate, right? There are a lot of these discussions where people say, well, Black people still want the police. I think by and large, we do. However, right, what we're really looking for is actually we want safety. However, that safety is presenting itself. We know the police exist, but what we may not be exposed to, certainly in my community, is violence interrupters or others that can be involved in things, other people that you trust and that you can build up in. And I think what all of us in the practical professions have a role in doing is saying, how do we build that? How do we actually make sure that everybody, right, can actually have that level of trust so that we're solving crimes, rather than what you have in a city like mine and many others, right? Hundreds of unsolved shootings each and every year, right? This epidemic of violence in the city, and the fact that, frankly, we are in stark different areas. You have a police union that's just saying, hire 200 more of us because that's going to make a difference, which in my view it will not, right? And others, right, that may be saying we don't need them at all. I mean, I do think, and I hate to, I guess I'm set up in this meeting to be the moderate position, but nevertheless, right, you kind of hate to just play that moderate position, but at the same time, right, I think we have to be real with there is something different we can do. And I will say this, and I appreciate the chief being on because I looked him up. Not all chiefs are like him. Too many chiefs right now are in a full back the blue moment, which is, I think, counterproductive to building a future of police community relations. They're big on, before we get to a point of saying, hey, how can we do better? How can we create better institutions? They're just saying, well, dang it, we're the heroes that are going out and people need to stand for us or they're against us, right? And then that builds, I think, so much of the great community angst we've seen. Departments that I've respected, chiefs that I've respected, are the ones that are saying, look, we want to do right what we are good at. We want to grow and solve crimes. We want to be better at it. We understand there may be some steps where there's something different. Alternatives when you call 911, right? Having other folks that can act, having somebody that can address the eagle or the falcon that flies into your house, right? Those sorts of things. And that's what I think smart cities, responsible cities are trying to do right now.
Josie, I want to come to you to both respond to the mayor and the chief, but also for kind of a top level look at, there are a lot of conversations about what the police are designed to do and the laws that we have created as a society and how they're supposed to be protected. But what does that kind of, the idea of living, we live in a society, what does that fundamentally mean? And how are the police and kind of legal infrastructure set up as a sort of way to mete out the justice in that society?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one of the things I was thinking when the chief was talking, it's funny because I think probably more, if you were to take 3 people from a random selection, we might all agree on this panel more than some of the sort of, I've talked to a lot of people in the past year, and these are not the extreme positions. But I think one of the things I think is relevant here is that the police have traditionally a lot of power among other politicians, right? Especially on the state level. And so police lobby, right? Police unions lobby, police departments lobby. I see, especially prosecutors, right? Lobby all the time for certain laws. And our criminal justice infrastructure does really shape, not individual officers necessarily, but the entire kind of profession. And the different parts of the profession do shape what is criminal in this country, right? State legislatures, they obviously don't actually pass the laws, but they do influence the passage of those laws. They do influence what we kind of decide as a community. So I think the idea that policing as a role is just enforcement is not reflected in every single level of government where police also have influence. I think like one of the things that I hear both the chief and the mayor saying, which makes a lot of sense to me, right? It's like when you are currently at this moment dealing with 4 people getting shot in your city, this is not like you're having a different conversation, and you're again already on the back end. The prevention moment is over, right? 4 people have been shot, and so now what? And I think this gets to another kind of fundamental misunderstanding I think most people have about crime, not the people on this panel, but most people, right? Which is like when you talk to people, they talk about they're scared of mainly something random happening, right? They're scared of the random guy shooting someone they care about, or their kid getting kidnapped or whatever. What people who I think do this work more regularly know, which is maybe more scary in some ways, is that like crime tends to occur between people who know each other, right? The chance of your kid, I mean, I could leave my kids outside with a sign that says "Take me," and nobody's taking my kids, probably, right? Trust me, they would return them immediately after they were with them for 5 minutes. But I think the idea of what scares us kind of as humans and parents and individuals is not actually reflective of like what happens when we see, most shootings are between people who know each other, right? Domestic violence in scenarios where no matter how good the police are, people are hesitant to call, the government on their loved ones, right? Like there are, and I, when I say good the police are, I mean, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum of how you view the police, you may be a big Back the Blue supporter, and if your husband's beating you, you still might not call the cops, right? Because that is not how you view, that does not serve your goals. You love this guy, whatever it is, the relationship there is more complicated than just call the police. And I say that to say that like what we see when it comes to violence is that it starts way before it actually shows up, right? By the time you're shooting 4 people, the moment of intervention has passed. And the question is, what should happen before that? Is it just understanding how, is it a basic understanding of your emotions and having the therapy and tools you need to handle your anger? Is it a conversation about masculinity? Is it a conversation about access to, resources? Is it a conversation about mental health? Is it a conversation, is it better divorce counselor? What is it that these people and these individual situations need to not even have law enforcement be part of the picture? And I think the reality is that like, that's a really complicated, not easily solvable question that you can't measure in the moment at any point, right? And that takes years and a lot of investment to find the right solutions to address violence from its source. And the truth is that in America, we don't like long investment. We don't like things that take a lot of time. We don't like things that aren't measurable. We don't like hearing "I don't know" as an answer, right? And so what we do is try to find these really really obvious, really punitive, and really probably in the long term, just not real solutions to our problems. And I think that, as much of anything, is why we have the criminal justice system that we have today, because not only is it vengeful, not only is it punitive, but it's an easy answer to a not easy question.
And students, I would like to remind you all that you can submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of the chat. Chief, I actually wanted to come to you to talk about kind of the pace of reform. I know that you may hear my dog in the background as well. I know you've spoken previously about sort of the way that people in the immediate aftermath of an incident, they will try to rush to reform and just kind of pick and choose policies that seem to have worked elsewhere. But I guess, could you just kind of talk about the concerns of moving too fast on reform? And then this is for everyone. Can reform be too fast in a situation where people are being unnecessarily subjected to maybe aggressive force or unnecessary uses of force?
I don't think reform could ever be too fast. I think it is exceedingly slow, and it takes a lot of time. Right now, one of the projects I'm involved in, I'm a member of the monitoring team for the Baltimore Police Department. That's a consent decree that's been going on since 2017. And the way you start these things is you look at what's going on within the agency right then, you review all policies, and then in conjunction with Department of Justice and City of Baltimore and the monitoring team, let's use of force. I'm the lead on that. We rewrote their entire use of force policy. But that's not enough, because then you have to train all the officers. And Baltimore is a city of over 3,000 police officers. Getting them all through the training took us about a year to 18 months. In the middle of that, the pandemic started. That stopped everything. It hit things. You need to get community and officer input. And I want to put a pin on that because I want to address the question, one of the questions that came up there about unions. So you do allow officer and community input into the development of the policies and the training. So it's a very long, drawn out process. So we started this in 2017. We just finally completed the use of force training and all the components of it just this last year, and are starting to, the policies are now live, and we address the issues of how Baltimore police conduct themselves based on the new policy. But that took almost 4 years to do. It's just putting policies in place and putting training in place, so it's not going to be the whole answer. You need to solve the mindset of the officers that are out there. And that correlates with several other areas that we're talking about, which one of them is, First Amendment rights. Another one is community policing, community engagement. Another one is mental health and crisis intervention training, to try and give officers tools, because right now they're still responding to these mental health calls. So it's a huge, huge ship that we're trying to turn. And that old adage is so accurate. It takes a long time to turn a ship, and water, especially with the seas, are as choppy as they are right now. I think that unions, and that was the question I want to address right now, and this, I think, goes back to something what Josie says, and I'll differ that police departments don't necessarily lobby, at least in the larger cities, they don't, because there's laws against that. But the police unions absolutely get involved politically, and they support candidates based upon the positions they take. They push forward legislation through these candidates. And so she's absolutely right. They play a huge role in some of the legislation that comes across. And sometimes they will push legislation that is self-serving, because it makes their job easier, or it puts them in a better financial position. I'm not going to lie and say that their financial pockets aren't part of the decisions that they make. And then also it gets in the way of a chief executive holding the department accountable. I know that, not trying to open up any can of worms here, but in Chicago today, they're talking about the whole issue of the president of the union and issues and statements that he's made on social media, and should that affect his job. And, I looked at those statements. I think it absolutely should affect his job. But the union will come out and support his rights as First Amendment in position. But it's a very delicate line, because you're representing a police agency. That curtails, in my opinion, a little bit of your rights when you're representing the agency. But he's representing the union. So it's a different vote. So there is that whole dynamic of police unions. Can they be obstructive to accountability? At times, I think they can, but also times I think they also serve to protect officers against issues of when they're being accused improperly or being treated improperly. So there is a role for them, but I think that they've become far too influential in the politics, the legislation, and more importantly, the discipline and accountability. As a chief, I fired a lot of people that I had to go before a civil review board, and you have individuals that sometimes are placed on that board through political efforts of the union, and they will support the employee at almost all costs. And so I had a good track record, because I had great internal affairs, and we were very good on chain of command on reviewing the staff. But there were a couple times when my decisions were overturned, and then I've got to take the person back, or I have to give them back into the rank that I demoted them from. So we try and put that accountability on the part of the chief executive, but then we have this other body that can interfere with it. So it is an issue that we do need to address.
And Mayor Lucas, just thinking about how you've implemented reforms, the reforms that have actually been kind of moved into practice, and then the reforms that have sort of been slower in terms of progress. Can you sort of talk about the practical implementation of police reform, kind of from the idea of reforming the department to it actually kind of moving into effect?
Well, I think you have to recognize that the budget conversation is actually where reform is the most impactful. I think every city that's mildly progressive or even moderate or even leans a little right probably passed a bunch of reforms that were in name only, that said things like We shall, do this. We may respond faster. We may do all these things. Everybody tries to speak the language of diversity, which, don't get me wrong, is good. But, right, you need to actually make sure you're having more budget accountability in connection with it. In Kansas City, we live under an even more colonial system than most, us, and Baltimore has elements of it, which relates to state control of the police department, which makes things incredibly frustrating because the public's saying we want to see a difference. This department costs for us $260 million a year. And, we're saying that basically we have to make sure it goes through a board. And so for us, really, the power of the purse is our biggest step in terms of how we see that there's actually reform being done and how we see accountability long term to it. But you have students on the line, and I respect them and all of that, and I know they're all going to change the world soon. People always ask me, where do y'all come up with these budgets? How does this all happen and all of that? I shouldn't be so cynical, but most of us are all kind of lazy. Go to any budget of any jurisdiction, and it looks a whole lot like the budget the last year, and the budget the year before, and the budget the year before, and the year before. That's why, in some ways, right, you are fighting inertia all the time, right? Because everybody's just saying, I got you. They call me Q. I got you, Q. But, right, I don't want to have to figure out how to rewrite $1.7 billion because where's this going and all of that? And so when you are talking about true reform, particularly sustainable reform, it has to present itself in a way of actually giving somebody that impetus to say, all right, we want to see that long-term change. We want to actually make sure we go through the work. We have the sophistication to go through the work, because that's another thing, right? I've been mayor on city council, been mayor for about a year and a half, was on city council before that. I still don't know half the stuff in the budget, right? You still have folks that are more sophisticated in connection with what's happening there, where the things are hidden. And so that's why it has to be something that every time you're making budget decisions, you really just need to almost change your rules and your policies to understand that you're thinking about equity in every decision you're making. You're thinking about true reform, long-term, and a number of those steps along the way. But yeah, you are fundamentally fighting a tradition, and a lot of folks, some folks just liking things the way they are, other folks not knowing that things don't always have to be this way. And I think that's where we can make real differences. One other thing that, I've always seen as important about reforms, and this is not to get heat off of anybody, but, in a lot of cities, we've done this sort of, let's fire X or Y person. So remember when I was coming up, Daryl Gates was the chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, right? Seemed incredibly problematic during the Los Angeles riots and all of that. He sticks around a little bit longer, but then, right, he retires eventually, right? Doesn't mean LAPD changed after that. Indeed, I believe they still have some challenges, right? We face that in our city and so many others, getting folks to know it is beyond the personalities. It's actually something about how do we get, right, this institution to see that it needs to interact with the city differently, and fundamentally the city to do it as well. And then I think voters to recognize that. A city that I'm watching, I'll stop after this, that I've been very impressed by is the city of St. Louis, Missouri, which, although having a very large Black population for years, had kind of elected the exact same mayor, except for this year. They elected their first Black female mayor, and she actually ran on a platform of, yes, we're a city with a high rate of homicides, a lot of shootings, and the 20-year approach of listen to the police union, it's the only way, be scared, wasn't working any longer. I think getting voters and the public beyond that, we're just afraid type of thing, and to a, this could be better because, right, we need something different, is going to be the way that you actually can see sustained change. But you importantly always, in any reform conversation, need to be able to address, all right, but how are you making it safer long-term too? I think that balance is kind of the key two-step that talented politicians understand.
We have a question from the audience, Sophie Hare.
Hello, my name is Sophie. I am a second year here in the college. I actually have a question for Ms. Duffy Rice. You noted that your eventual goal is for the police to no longer need to exist. And so I was curious if there are any communities in our country that you could point to that have shaped legislation in a particular way that you believe will move our society or their small community towards that goal.
Thanks, Sophie. That's a good question. I think there are many examples of people slowly moving towards that goal. They can be really small examples like schools who say, okay, we're not going to call the cops for a schoolyard fight. But they're bigger examples like people implementing non-emergency responders. You think about Cahoots, a program that's in Eugene, Oregon. We have a new kind of 311 program here in Atlanta. People who, again, actually are funding mental health, are funding the kind of services necessary. And maybe every place with an animal control that responds is slowly moving towards abolition too. I mean, these are examples of trying to remove the police from some interactions. I think, and I think maybe a clear example, and I used this example online a while ago, is just think about your local suburbs, right? Suburbs where they're wealthy and there aren't cops on every corner, and the police, the trash pickup is regular, and the sidewalks are clean, and there aren't needles on the ground, or fights or murders, or really or you're not seeing high levels of crime. In many places in America, they practice abolition, right? The police are not major parts of the community. And again, they're using cancer prevention and not chemotherapy. Now, they're not totally abolitionists. And again, if you needed the police, they'd be there. And so that's not to say that they don't have access to law enforcement, which is a big part of what law enforcement is access, right? But it's just to say that there are communities across the world, across the country, where they're kind of practicing abolition, even though it's not intentional. And it's just a reminder that, like, what we all acknowledge as valuable is investment on the front end, right? The question is just who has access to that and who has the ability to provide it.
Our next question comes from Ale Clark Ansani.
Hey, thank you all for being here today. I'm a 1L at the law school, and I'm an alumnus of the college. My question is also for Ms. Duffy Rice, and I think relates to the former one. There's a lot of discussion about sort of quote unquote non-reformist reforms that recognize there's sort of this immediate necessary change that needs to happen with our criminal legal system, but it recognizes that we want to be moving towards a future of abolition. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what those reforms look like that address a lot of the harms of our current carceral system, but also help move us towards that ideal future.
Yeah, I think the non-reformist reforms conversation is a really important one, because when you use words like reform, anything can be kind of considered reform. And often what these like reforms do is actually just increase power, increase funding, and sometimes decrease oversight. So I think a good example is, for years, there was a big focus on community policing, broken windows policing, which isn't to say that, like, in some places they haven't demonstrated some level of shift in crime rates or whatever, but is to say that it has not reduced the reliance on police, and is once again kind of trying to like shift the relationship with police in a way that actually increases their power, rather than put that responsibility on other resources, other social services. And so, like, body cameras is another example where it's not to say that it, like, my opinion on body cameras is probably like, it's complicated, but just to say that, like, the idea of that being real reform, I think, is a complicated one. And it's not real reform. Same thing with like implicit bias trading, which hasn't really demonstrated its effectiveness and requires more funds and more power. And so I think the non-reformist reforms thing is a really important thing to keep in mind. Then again, like, I find that there's, as someone who also went to law school, my condolences, by the way, for you being in law school, but I think all the time about what is the difference between my friends that are actually practitioners, that are in court every day, that have clients that are in immigration court or in criminal court in different places across the country, and my role, where I'm thinking really big. What they need today, and what some of these reforms, even if they don't feel huge to us, but actually matter in people's lives, right? They are helping less people be arrested. They're helping get people out of prison. They're helping get people out of jail. And it may not be abolition, but it may, or even defunding in certain situations, but it has a real impact on people who are implicated in the system. I have a brother that's been in and out of jail and prison for many years, and the things that can help him matter, right? And so we're always balancing this very complicated relationship between, does this get us towards the ultimate goal? And does this have an effect, help people right now who are involved in the system who need that help? And it's complicated. Now, I think there are things that are reforms that don't do either, but that are framed as reforms. And those are the things that I think are really concerning, because they are, smoke and mirrors. And I really like the background in your picture. Yeah, beautiful.
Chief Villaseñor, I know you wanted to respond to something.
I do, and I don't really disagree with most of what Josie was saying there, but I do want to inject something in there, and this may be somewhat controversial, and I hope people will listen to me, hear me out. What you're talking about in, I'm assuming the wealthy suburbs and the issues where there's hardly any police presence there and things go along smoothly. We're not also talking about the element, though, is that those people haven't dealt with all the persecution and all the suppression and all the issues. They're dealing with those who are usually in minorities, people of color, who have had to deal with the way society has treated them and all the issues of the past. Right. That have placed them in a lower socioeconomic area. And the anger that brings with it and the desperation to try and survive brings with it causes more crime. So obviously the police are going to be a higher presence in more crime areas. So you have to always remember there's a part of this that relies back on how people conduct their daily lives and whatever influences that conduct. And please, I just really want to emphasize, I'm not saying, well, we're there because only crime happens in communities of color, but the reality is that usually the more violent crime does happen in communities of color because of the more suppression and oppression that have occurred to communities of color. And so I think that's what I'm hearing is that let's try and deal with some of that oppression and some of that past and try and fix that and provide more front-end input into education, into social services, into things that help eliminate some of that oppression and that pressure, and then that'll start us on that path to what you're calling there is the abolishing of the need for police. I'm on line with that, but right now, we still got to come when the call comes in about a shooting of 4 people down the street. And if people aren't calling us, that's problematic. I live in Tucson, Arizona, and we're 50 miles from the Mexican border, and it's still the huge issue of immigration and how that affects when people are willing to call police. You have a large part of our community that have been set up as, criminal ATMs almost because of lack of desire to contact police when they're victimized. And that can't be allowed to happen. So we got to overcome that in some way. But that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
So we have time for one last question, and it comes from Mira from the Booth School of Business. I ask, how do we as regular citizens contribute to this national conversation and promote change? This will be a question for all of you. Mayor Lucas, I'm going to come to you first.
Simple. Stay engaged and believe that something different can happen. I was asked on NPR not long ago, do you have hope for the future? And actually, it was about a year ago, and I said, I don't. Part of it was kind of reflecting on things and moments where I had seen before in my life that we were mad after the verdicts after the Rodney King beating, right? You then go a few years, you have your next controversy. You have Amadou Diallo. You have all these sorts of things. I think right now the consistency actually gives me hope that folks are staying engaged, that folks are seeing that there is a different way we must do things. And so I would say stay engaged however you'd want. And look, I run for office, so I want people to vote and all of that, but I recognize that there are other ways to do it, right? Some of that might be getting people engaged on social media. It might be talking to friends and family and others. And it certainly might be actually interacting with institutions around you, be it your schools, your public servants, et cetera. And so I think that is the way that you actually do it. But don't give up in the sense that you think nothing will change or nothing will ever change. Part of why I ever started running for office were problems that I saw problems of I went to college and I saw that everybody I was going to college with was smoking weed like it was absolutely legal and all that sort of stuff. But you go a few blocks off campus and folks are starting to pick up records for that very sort of thing. I did not think at that time that we would see treatment of folks change in connection with that. We have at least started to see some of that, right? Those are the sorts of things that I think we need to push and continue to change. And your engagement does a large part of that.
Chief Villasenor, coming to you next. Same question.
The mayor nailed it. I mean, we have to keep our involvement up. And I think that even though right now, coming from the law enforcement profession, the microscope that we're under is truly uncomfortable. But I think it does serve a purpose. Where I get concerned is that we go overboard on things and we start to paint all police based upon the events that we see day after day on the news. But when you think about the millions of contacts that occur every day and that these few events come up, and please don't get me wrong, one is too many. But it's being painted in a way that this is the only way police interact with people, particularly people of color. And I know from personal experience that is not true. But that part never gets out in the conversation. So I think we need to keep focused on there, but I would like to see a little bit more realistic perception of what police are doing out there. The old adage, it's just a few bad apples gets thrown out in defense of that. Well, I don't like that either, because the second part of that is if you don't get rid of those bad apples, it spoils the whole barrel. So let's get rid of those bad apples. Let's bring accountability in and responsibility for police actions. When they do something wrong, just like any other profession, they're human, get those people out that are bad apples. But don't say the rest of the barrel is already spoiled when that's not the case either. So keep going.
And Josie, I think we may have lost. He's back. But Josie, I'm actually going to come to you for the last word.
Yeah, I guess I would. I think I don't like either conversation about the apples, right? I don't like the way that we isolate some people and identify them as bad apples and say the other people are not. And I don't like the idea that they're all bad apples, because I think it misunderstands the way that systems affect us and that all of us are complicated people who certain systems encourage the worst parts of us and certain ones encourage the best parts of us. I think that's true for all people. I think it's true for certain people who have committed bad crimes. I think it's true for people with the power of the state. And so the question to me here is about power. So my position on this is the same thing that my position is on police unions, which would be to the thing that you can do, I mean, other than joining stuff like this and continuing to have these conversations, is to always be looking for the source of power. To me, police unions are powerful because police are powerful, not the other way around. We actually know that most unions in this country can't pick up any steam for anything whenever they, that union power in this country has been depleting for a generation. And that what we actually see is that police unions are the ones that have kind of kept more power than most other unions, right? Because police are powerful. And if we want to really start to question where we want our resources going, where we want our social services to show up, do we want chemotherapy or cancer prevention, then we really start to think about power. And that's what I think a lot of this gets back to. To the chief's point, it is true that millions, we have 100 million, I think, 50 million police interactions in this country per year, right? Most of them do not end in death, but that doesn't mean the other ones are always great. A lot of them, a lot of the ways that police interact with communities is not the way we want to be interacting with our government, right? And so to be able to see all the different levels of that and to be able to think how that can shift, that's the most that we can do. And again, I would say budgets are priorities. So you look at your local budget and ask, where these resources are going. That's my main advice.
Well, as we've seen today, these are big questions to which there are no easy answers, but I look forward to continuing this conversation. Mayor Lucas, Chief Villasenor, Josie, thank you all so much for a vibrant conversation. And to the students, thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Adam. This is great.
Thank you for having us.
you.